Hello, everyone, and welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Hal Levinka, and I'm the event director at the bookstore, and I'm absolutely thrilled today to welcome Peter Filkins and Vijay Seshadri here for a reading from their new work. While the pandemic has taken a toll across all of our lives, virtual programs like the one you're about to see have become bright spots in our days, and I want to give a huge thanks to our guests for joining us tonight. So to housekeeping, you should be able to see and hear our presenters, but they cannot see or hear you. So if you have any questions, please click on the Q&A button here at the bottom of your screen to submit them. We will be asking those at the end of the program, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. There's also a chat button here at the bottom of the screen through which I'll be posting links to purchase tonight's books if you haven't already. A caveat for tonight's event and for all virtual events, we're all at the mercy of our home internet connections and server loads, so please bear with any technical issues that might arise. We will try to solve them quickly. And finally, we've scheduled a whole host of spring programming leading into the summer, so head over to our website and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date. One that I want to mention, tomorrow on April 8th, we're thrilled to be hosting Helen Oyeyemi for the release of her new novel, Pieces, in conversation with Sarah Gran. Again, that program is on our website now and taking registrations. So now a little about tonight's guests, and we will get started. Peter Filkins' new book, Water Music, is his fifth collection of poetry, the translator of Ingeborg Bachmann's collected poems and 3 novels by H.G. Adler. He teaches writing and literature at Bard College at Simon's Rock and translation at Bard's main campus. His work has received a Berlin Prize, 2 NEH fellowships, and an Alta Outstanding Translation Award, and a Best Book Award from the New England Poetry Club. His poems, essays, reviews, and translations have appeared in the Paris Review, the Iowa Review, the American Scholar, the Threepenny Review, the New York Times Book Review, and numerous other publications. And Vijay Seshadri is the author of 3 sections, winner of the Pulitzer Prize, The Long Meadow, winner of the James Laughlin Award of the Academy of American Poets, Wild Kingdom, and he teaches at Sarah Lawrence College and lives in Brooklyn, New York. And Vijay is doing double duty tonight at another event, so if he has to duck out, we thank him for joining us, but otherwise we will just kick off with some readings from Vijay.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Hal. And it's great to be at the community bookstore virtually. I mean, it's my neighborhood bookstore, but it's sort of over in Park Slope, and I'm in Carroll Gardens. And it's great to be reading with Peter. Peter and I have known each other since 1982, the fall of 1982. And we've led parallel lives as writers, and I jumped on the chance to be a part of this reading with him to celebrate the publication of his book, Water Music, and I've been reading it all day. I've had it for about a week, but I haven't had a chance to get to it, and it's beautiful, limpid work, formal, but utterly intimate at the same time. Rich in its feeling for nature, and so I'm very, very happy to be here with him. I'm going to read 3 poems, and then Peter's going to read 3, and then I'm going to read 3 more, and then he's going to read 3, and then we're going to go to the Q&A, and I will jump off, but I will jump back on, and so I thought I'd start with the first poem in my most recent book, which came out last fall. And read that, and then read a poem in the middle, and then read a poem at the end. And, the first poem is called Road Trip. Road Trip. I could complain, I've done it before. I could explain. I could say, for instance, that I'm sick of being slaughtered in my life's mountain passes, covering my own long retreat, the rear guard of my own brutal defeat, dysentery and frostbite and snipers, the mules freezing to death, blizzards whipping the famished fires until they expire, the pathetic mosquito notes of my horn. But instead, for once, I'm keeping quiet, and maybe tomorrow, or maybe the day after, or maybe the day after that, I'm just going to drive away down the coast and not come back. I haven't told anyone, and I won't. I won't dim with words the radiance of my gesture. And besides, the ones who care have guessed already. Looking at them, looking at me, I know they know. When they turn their backs, I'll go. The secrets I was planning to floor them with, they're already packed in my trunk in straw in a reinforced caskets. The bitter but herbal and medicinal truths I concocted to revive them with, tomorrow or the day after that, on the volcano beaches fringed with black sand and heaped with tangled beds of kelp, by the obsidian tide pools that cradle the ribbed limpet and the rock-bound star. I'll scatter those truths to the sea breezes and float the secrets on the waters that the moon reels in and plays out, reels in and plays out, with a little votive candle burning on their casket. And then I'll just be there, in the sunset's coppery sheen, in the dawn pearled by discreet, oblong, intimate clouds that move without desire or motive. Look at the clouds. Look how close they are. This next poem is called Meeting. There are two versions of it in the book. This is the thick version. It's called Meeting, parentheses, thick, close parentheses. I'll meet if you really want to meet. I'll even meet in some small cafe or some park across the way. But I won't meet for long, and not for a minute will I look at you in your isolation, your human isolation. Looking at yours makes me look at mine. Transparencies of each other are they, yours and mine. And I don't have time for mine, so how could I have time for yours? When I knew you, I had time for mine. When I knew you, imagining my skeletal, streaming, solitary, oceanic swimming enlarged my dignities. Not anymore. No time for the nostalgias, infinite, infinitesimal, and the ones in between. No time to pretend I can sustain anyone or even understand how they feel, to show by the grave downward turn of the face, the haunted eyes, the image of an impossible inward stricken empathy. The contradictions are unsupportable. And I don't have time to not support mine. So how could I not support yours too? I don't even have time to write this text. See how uninflected it is? Without rhetoric, expatiation, form, concreteness, geography, weather, flora, fauna, plain and bare, which shows you I'm sincere. No Denali, no great rift, no 7-year trillium, and not one Phoebe in the woods getting ready to sing.
Thank you, Vijay. It's wonderful reading. And I want to thank Hal and the community bookstore and Vijay as well. To be reading with you is such a pleasure. Our friendship has meant so much to me in these times of pandemic and separation and isolation. You're one person I've always thought of and miss dearly. Our dinners and our meetings and our long conversation of poetry and life's passages, and that's just meant the world to me. Also, your poems, just their ability to be up against it and yet find joy in the language and the redeeming sense of wit and humor that comes from them, and how much I enjoy reading them anytime I encounter them. So it's a pleasure to be reading with you. This is kind of the first national reading I'm doing from Water Music. It was published yesterday, and the title is Water Music. It has a slash in between the two words. And the reason for that is I think of the book as treading the border between culture and nature. I live in Western Massachusetts on a lovely lake, and I actually have lived here all my life and know this landscape very well, and so I feel powerfully drawn to write about it. But I'm also a citizen of the world and interested in art and politics and history, and so the book is kind of a mixture of those two things. The first section is very much tied to history and sort of our current times. I'll begin with a poem called Blood Moon Blues. It concerns a blood moon, which we often call a full eclipse of the moon, or an October moon we often call a blood moon, but technically a blood moon is very rare. It is the fourth full eclipse with no partial eclipses in between, 4 consecutive full eclipses. And to give you an indication of how rare it is, between 1580 and 1909, there were no blood moons whatsoever. And there were only a handful in the 20th century. It happens to be that the last one was in September of 2015. And I actually witnessed it on Cape Cod off of Wellfleet. And the world was kind of heating up at that stage, and blood moons have often been seen as a portent. And I thought this was a time for such a portent in the summer, late or autumn of 2015. Blood Moon Blues. Protesters marched, shutting down cities. Senators sponsored their own annuities. Car bombs were back, hemlines higher. Forecasters tracked low fronts and fires. Children were told their parents were thugs. Governments banned playgrounds and hugs. Analysts mourned stagnating markets. Terrorists surveyed expanded new targets. Refugees crossed invisible borders, arriving malnourished, colder and poorer. High up above, a blood moon rose, the seas churned on, the shore decomposed. Venus and Mars ascended in unison. Glaciers kept forming palatial ruins, while higher yet, at the back of space, a star imploded, leaving no trace, but hydrogen and helium, the seeds of our genus, potent as love or a neutral virus. The first section, again, tries to deal with the contemporary landscape. And of course, one of the features of that landscape is the unfortunate shootings that we have so often experienced, be they in Atlanta or Boulder, or it seems like once a week, once a day, some shooting takes place somewhere. Down the road from me is a road literally called Nobody's Road. And I thought that would always be useful in a poem somehow. And finally, on the occasion of the Sandy Hook shooting, it occurred to me that this was the time to make use of that moniker, Nobody's Road. Nobody knows what troubled the kid. Nobody even knew where he lived. Nobody remembers hearing a thing. Nobody considered inquiring. Nobody thought to call the police. Nobody worried it would come to this. Nobody can say how he got inside. Nobody knows yet how many died. Nobody can think of just what to do. Nobody can help but feel deja vu. Nobody agrees how to prevent it. Nobody wants their rights suspended. Nobody can fathom the depth of such grief. Nobody is sure just what to believe. Nobody can undo what has been done. Nobody is watching the neighbor's son. You can't live in a world like that too much in poetry, I find. And also to do so sort of violates the reality of where I do live in nature and the world around me. So the second section sort of returns to the world of nature, but in perhaps a more meditative internal way. It's a poem called Ashore, which is really about living on a lake, or the nature of living on a lake. And it's in 3 sections which have subheadings, which I'll just read as I read the poem. Ashore. Map. Where we are going, it isn't clear, since where we are is already here. Aware the far shore is a bit more near than first expected or was made clear. By starlight guiding the course we steer, blithely upon the cusp of fear. of never knowing that it's clear where we are going is already here. Survey. How deep is the lake? As deep as it gets. Who dammed the river? Nobody yet. Which way runs the current? Both east and west. Can you swim in it? Try your best. Has anyone ever drowned? A few, not all. Are there any fish in it, large and small? What is its name? Kettle in Mohegan. How long has it been here? A day and an eon. Does it ever freeze over, absent the sun? How long have you lived here? The water flows on. Census. Fishermen on the lake make no mistake and cast their line ashore. Fishermen on the shore want something more and strike the hidden middle. The wide water waits, mysterious and calm, its depths built for drowning, its surface always level.
Vijay, I think that you're muted.
Okay, am I good now?
Great.
Okay. I guess responding to Peter to a certain extent, I will hold on a second. I think I've sort of lost my poems here. I'll read a poem that also addresses the violence of the world, but in some sense is an antipathetic response to the world's violence. It's called The Idol of the Tribe. And it's not a poem I even understand. It's being in a situation and not understanding your own poems. The Idol of the Tribe. I look at you with my vexed eye. I look at you with my hostile eye. I look at you with my hostile and vexed eye. My hostile, vexed eye is a wrench. My vexed eye is a socket wrench. My vexed and hostile socket wrench eye twists the bolt that hinges your mandible free from its frozen grooves. You scream, but we go on turning, eye in my eye. I know what I'm into. I know what I've been put here for. I've been put here for you. The ducks in the marshland line up. By the mallows they resemble, but no miracle of nature can delay me. Snow, rain, heat, etc. can't stay me from the completion of my dismantling you, my being rid of you. I remove your jaw, I lay it aside. Your neck bone I disconnect from your shoulder bone. Your shoulder bone I disconnect from your breastbone from your backbone from each rib from the sound of your Lord. Your tinted waters laden with debris stream from your split flanks. Your truths take on their true proportions. How small they always were, not false, but trivial. I make a heap out of you. You're not dead, of course. You said yourself you can never die. So that was never the point. The point is this: here, around me, you're disassembled, You're a junkyard. You've been sacrificed. This one is in a different vein. It's called Marriage. You keep complaining that there are two people inside me. The one confident, decisive, ironic. The other a raging cripple who never took to the nipple, whose life has been one long episode of colic. Just admit you don't know which one you like better, which one rings your bell. I happen to like them both. I make the one drive the other around and around the glistening night streets of our town to try and calm him down. I want them to be inseparable, inevitable. I don't want the children to suffer. And this is the last poem in the book. And I'll read it and hop off and then hop back on. It's called To the Reader. And in this case, you should sort of transpose the verbs and think of yourselves as listeners rather than readers. To the Reader. I'm writing this so I can tell you that what you're thinking about me is exactly what I'm thinking about you. What you're reading is exactly what you're writing. By the light of a taper, deep inside yourself, at your walnut secretary. These words are saying what those words say, and these and those are those and these, mine and yours, and have no meaning, only form. Talk about being one with others. We correspond one to one, and there is a grandeur in this. You'll understand that someday. Just now, though, you're stupefied at this spooky action at a distance. So would I be, and I am. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay. It's a great ending poem to the book. It's just fantastic. I know you got to go off to do what you got to do, and
I'll be back though.
Okay, thanks, man.
Okay.
I'm going to go on with a poem called Water Lilies in the third section of the book, which returns to the world from this sort of interior world, nature world of the second section, returns to history, but I think in a different way, engages art and artists and fellow poets and memory poems. This is about Claude Monet painting his famous water lilies during World War I, which is the principal activity he conducted during World War I. While he could hear the bombardments of the trenches only 50 miles away, his own son was in those trenches fighting the war as well. Monet was into his 80s at that stage, and it was simply all he knew how to do while the world was collapsing around him. Having mentioned his son, the last word in the poem is son, but it's S-U-N, not S-O-N. Water Lilies, Claude Monet, 1917. Meanwhile, he painted them. Lilies floating on the surface of a pond he'd constructed for the pleasure of the eye, and motifs to paint at century's end. The new one begun with multiple explosions of carmine, coral, white fleshy flowers against the backdrop of a subsurface blue with distances. The sky stretched out upon the watery calm, where a cloudy puff would later be captured by his brush in motion. Each day in the studio, another one spent to the echo of guns, bombarding the trenches, pummeling the Somme, erupting in billows of char-black smoke beyond a horizon no longer present, but subsumed, erased, immersed as he was in the flux of light on water, flowers astride turbid shallows beneath a willow and its weeping, our only perspective in a lost world lost to bottomless translucency, the eye that sees it, and the intractable sun. Another poem about a painting, but not a painting. I was at a writing residency a couple of years ago in January, looked out the window and really thought I was looking at a JMW Turner painting, a great wash of light and energy and motion. And what I was looking at was the sun, morning sun, shining through a squall of snow, and immediately sat down to write about it. And it's the only time in my life that I have written a poem in real time. And that is to say, it took me about an hour to draft the poem. And just as I was finishing the poem, I looked up and the storm was over. And so the completion of the poem and the event itself corresponded almost perfectly. And I have to say, I revise poems a lot, but this one didn't have much revision down the road. Sun through snow. Turner could have done no better, nor did he, articulating the light made now radiant, prismatic, hills, lake, trees, and woolen sky filtered by this sun-threaded squall of snow, as real as veneration, the smell of rain, the heft of stone, or the thought that within the hour it will be gone, the whir and waft and thrust of clouds and light, electric with the backlit pulse and shimmer of each ray of snow, consigned to memory and weather, closing down this moment's glow. Finally, from the same section, a memory poem called The Wild Boar. This is a true story. I was lucky enough to visit Berlin, and particularly East Berlin, before the wall came down. So this would have been 1984, 85 or so. And the way you got to Berlin in those days was to arrange to drive at a particular hour and arrive at a particular hour in Berlin, because you drove through East Germany and you had to stay on the highway. You could never get off of it. You'd be in big trouble if you were found. And I actually arranged for a hitchhiking ride. You could do this. They had a service in West Germany to do that. And when I got to the place to take the ride, discovered that the car was actually an out-of-service ambulance, driven by two hippies, quite frankly. And so we rode in that to Berlin, and in the middle, it was at night too, to add to that, pitch dark. And we were driving along, and bang, hit something, and got out and discovered that the poem reveals that we had hit a wild boar. And the poem remembers that event. The wild boar. Was it Kiki or Heinz who offered us that ride at dusk from Hamburg to Berlin those many years ago? The sun setting across the barren expanse of a North Sea march, as the car, an out-of-service ambulance, pulled onto the transit highway from which there was no getting off, except to stop, wait for the East German cops to show up, and question the driver and his passengers as to why we'd halted the car and delayed our scheduled arrival in Berlin, surrounded as we were by borderless frozen fields, vacant as the eyes of that policeman, unable, or at least unwilling, to believe we'd hit something in the dark, which, bang, was there and gone, the driver turning onto the gravel shoulder as we got out to assess the damage done. The headlights shattered and caved in, while at the edge caught in the twisted chrome, and there for the cop to inspect, the bristles of a boar, we'd hit, which none of us could see or saw as it crossed into our path all those years ago, the wind slicing through us, that transit highway bleak as the thought of tomorrow among the closed off reaches where that boar still ran, wounded and mortal. Was it Gabi? Was it Fritz? Thanks very much. And I think I will take some questions, and hopefully Vijay will be back with us soon for questions as well.
Great. Yeah, what a poem to end on that one. Okay, we do have some questions, so we will start at the top. Peter, can you talk a little bit about where you live and how your sense of location and place informs your poetry?
Yeah, I actually live in the house I grew up in. It's very unusual. I joke, I know the history of blades of grass in my lawn. That's how I know this landscape so well. It used to be a summer house, and then my wife and I bought it over 30 years ago and converted it into a year-round house. It's a very small lake in the Berkshires, and yet I grew up in that world of being on water all the time. I've listened to water music, if you will, my whole life. It does have a changing music. Even in winter, the ice forms over the lake and expands and contracts and makes the sound like whales singing. And it's a lovely thing to hear. So I just feel that, and my family's lived in this area on the same street for 250 years. So and we're just middle class, working people. It's not blue bloods or anything like that. But so I just feel an enormous connection to place. On the other hand, I've traveled. I did graduate school at Columbia in New York. I've lived in Vienna. I've lived in Berlin. Spent a lot of time doing researching on biography of H.G. Adler that I wrote a couple of years ago. So I have a sense of a larger world, but it's always kind of returns to this world. And I have a tremendous sense of stability and foundation, and kind of knowing who I am. And I guess I'd add a further thing. A couple of years ago, when things were really bad, the rhetoric, the politics, the craziness of this world, a poem like Blood Moon Blues is responding to that, or Nobody's Road. But I also began to say, no, the best thing I can do is to find a way to formulate this world and stand it up against that world. And that's really the project of Water Music, the book itself, is to find a way. The epigraph for the last section is from Theodore Roethke's notebooks. And it says, if there is not another life, there is at least another way to live. And that's the journey that I hope to trace in the book itself and through the poems.
And just as a reminder that I should have lodged at the beginning, if anyone has a question, you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and submit it, and then I will see it. So actually, picking up from bringing up the first poem that you did read, can you talk about the responsibilities that one might face when incorporating politics or contemporary tragedy? You mentioned the shootings into one's work.
Yeah, I think you got to be fair, and I think it's not about finger pointing. The source word of politics is polis. We're all a part of the polis. We own the politics, even the politics we don't like. And I think it's important not to take the easy pot shot. I have a poem in the book called "To the Eminent Hate Mongers," and the first line is, I too have wandered in the provinces of blame. In other words, I'm as guilty of this. Okay. So I think it's the first thing. And I think the first and the last thing is the poem itself. And actually Nobody's Road is a good example, because when I first wrote it, I had 20 lines in the poem purposely for the 20 children who died at Sandy Hook. And for years, I had those 20 lines in there. And Wyatt Prunty is the editor of the Johns Hopkins series. And Wyatt did a wonderful job of really leaning on the poems and helping to edit them. And actually wasn't him, but he questioned a number of things. We changed a number of things. And really, right at the end, I realized the poem only had 18, there was only 18 lines. It couldn't be 20. And then I, of course, realized, well, why should I think it could be 20? What was I thinking, right? That a poem could stand, right? And it was humbling, but it was humbling in the face of the event and humbling in the need to attend to the needs of the poem. Yeah.
I'm going to jump over to the chat because there was a question over here. This is a question to both of you, but we'll start with you, Peter. Both of you are mature poets. How have you grown as poets, and how is your poetry today different from the poetry you were writing 30 years ago? And are you happy with yourself in your poems now?
Well, yeah.
Don't say not happy about yourself. You happy about your poems.
Yeah, I don't know about myself. That's
Yeah.
a whole nother thing. Yeah, right. And Vijay and I have long talks about that. But I think how they've changed. Nature's always been there, and history's always been there. Painting has always been there. Art, elegy. There's always an elegy. Every book, I have a 6-part elegy for Seamus Heaney. In this book, an elegy for Richard Wilbur, who was a dear friend. I think the poems have become looser. Though I found myself reading a lot of the rhyming poems tonight. I don't know why that happened. But there's a whole section of 12 poems, which are all free verse and very kind of atmospheric and sort of thought poems, as opposed to narrative poems with a subject or a landscape. So I think I've had more and more variety in the styles of my poems. Books are very hard for me to pull together because I write about so many different kinds of subjects. So this book has 5 sections. I end up organizing the book into sections in order to cohere the voice. I don't think I have any one particular style. I can write a jazzy, bluesy poem like Blood Moon Blues, or the Water Lilies, which is sort of more meditative or ashore. I can write a political poem like The Eminent Hate Mongers. And I kind of really believe in that. I think I'm interested in form. Vijay and I share that. We talk a lot about that. But I want the form to cohere to the function. I'm not locked into any kind of form. And I think translation, having translated poetry and translating novels, helps me do this, because you have to be very nimble and flexible as a translator, and it also expands your vocabulary immensely. And so the longer I've written, the richer and bigger my vocabulary has become, or the vocabulary with which I am comfortable. Let me put that way.
That actually branches into another question that we have that is about your work in translation and its influence on your poetry. Has it altered your sense of usage in English, or your sense of rhythm in English?
Yeah. Yes and no. I think everybody, the principal poet I've translated is Ingeborg Bachmann. And everybody asks me a question, has Bachmann influenced my poetry? And I would say no. I have this little Ingeborg Bachmann voice that I can turn on and turn off. It's just the same way I have an H.G. Adler voice I can turn on and turn off. But what has influenced me is, of course, working with long German sentences. If I have a tick as a poet, is that I have a lot of poems which are a single sentence. The Wild Boar is a single sentence. Water Lilies is a single sentence. And that German syntax, reeling it out, has really influenced my writing, I think. And then the second thing is I have to understand the one word in German. I've probably got to have a dozen English words at my fingertip to make the right choice. So that again expands your vocabulary. And breaks you out of one single kind of voice, because you end up mimicking, adapting many other voices. I think it's what attracts me to writing elegies. If I write an elegy, I most often try to write in the voice of the person the elegy is for. It's homage more than even elegy in a sense.
You're really linking these questions together perfectly for me. Someone did ask, what are your thoughts about Bachmann now?
Oh, I still love her work. I really do. I actually wrote a long essay delivered as a lecture in London about her letters to Paul Celan last January, and I hadn't really revisited her work in a long time, and it held up. I think she was one of the great writers of the 20th century. I think her novel Malina is one of the top 25, whatever number, silly number you want to put on it, but I think it's a must read. Vijay actually read it a few months ago and emailed me and said, this is a poet's novel. And it really is. So I think, she has held up. She's very durable and very, very important.
Yeah, we when the novel came out, I know a few people that are attending the event now, and they certainly own copies because we forced it in their hands.
And it's a great translation by Phil Bean, I must say.
Here's one other question that we have, and then we might hear one other poem from you and see if we can get Vijay back onto the program. You invoke history and myth in your work. Are you a casual reader of history in your daily life, or do you approach history as research?
No, I would say, well, both. Now I think about it's both. I love reading history. If I'm going to read anything, it's probably a nonfiction book, as much as a book of poems, unless it's a book that I've really been waiting for or want to discover. But more than likely, a nonfiction book is going to feed me something that I can use in a poem. Having said that, if I am writing, in my previous book, The View Were Granted, I have a 4-section poem on Constable's Clouds. I saw a show in Berlin of Constable's sketches of clouds, oil sketches of clouds. Loved it, absolutely loved it. And then, yes, began to research what he was doing. And he writes about those paintings, and he writes about painting in general and his letters and what was happening in his life. So I'm not afraid to do research, but I don't sort of set out to do research and then write the poem. I find that I have something going in a poem and I want to learn more about it. Blood Moon Blues would be the case. I'd heard the phrase blood moon. I thought, well, what is a blood moon? And then you find out more, and it can be useful or not. Yeah.
We actually have one more question now too. So do you have any poems that you've written over the years that you've wanted to include in collections and they just don't make it in over and over and over? And can you discuss why? When do you get the sense that something is either not ready or not right for something, or maybe never right for something?
I'm pretty hard on myself. I find the ratio that works out. This book has 53 poems. There's always just as many poems that are left out of the book as there are in the book. So there's another 50 poems floating around the house here. I never throw them away. They stack and stack. So that just seems to be the ratio that works for each book. Why does a poem make it in? Well, most often it's just not strong enough. It's not ready. I just don't feel it yet. Once in a while, it just doesn't fit into any of the other poems. By now there are just some poems that, oh God, I would love to retrieve them and bring them alive, but they're just too far behind me, and I've moved on metaphysically or something. And I'm stubborn as I am, I'll go back and try, and then I realize, you Dummkopf, this is just too old. It just doesn't work for you anymore. But I'm patient, and I will continually revise. If I publish a poem in a journal, that doesn't mean it's going to end up in the book. Also means that I am very willing to revise it at any time. I will do anything to make a poem better. Yeah.
Great. So Peter, do you want to share another poem or two while we see if we can get Vijay back in the window?
Sure. Since I mentioned it, why not? Let's go with the To the Eminent Hate Mongers. This is Perfect. Actually a section of a poem. The poem is called Triptych, and it has 3 sections, but I'll just read this section. They're kind of 3 distinct poems that work on their own. To the Eminent Hate Mongers. I too have wandered in the provinces of blame, climbed the heady peaks of disdain to breathe the bellicose air of mockery, They, them, you, and us, the fertile seeds of lush resentment, sprouting its fruits and grains in hothouses of malice, overheated incubators oxygenating through the night, the artificial blossoms of fear, the fibrous roots of treachery. Ah, such satisfaction! And how very sweet the taste of dime store righteousness. Who knew it could feel this pleasurable? Whole countries chugging sudsy draughts of smug, oak-aged vintages of anger, following hard on the heels of those tasty distractions, bitterness and spite, the flourishing and succulent harvest of hate ripened on smears. Yet remember, my friends, remember, beware the curse of language. Its deft perversions, once unleashed, return always and ever to eradicate all who consume them, poisoning you, they, them, and us, until the very smell of knowledge or conviction or simple decency is enough to sicken, enough to cramp and roil and wretch whatever is left of the gutted truth that will undo you, showing up one day in the duchy of triumph, there inside the tower of cynicism, at the resplendent ego's banquet, where softly afoot and on supple tawny hands your heaping plates will be carried in, the cook announcing, with a smile as sharp and bright as the grudge he harbors, "Ladies and gentlemen, come to the table. It is time to eat your meal."
Vijay, welcome back.
Thanks. Yeah, that was great. I'm sorry I didn't hear the beginning of that.
Sorry.
That was perfectly tied into our questions. So Vijay, we had a couple of that were specifically for you. So I'm going to start with those, and then we'll revisit some that were for both of you.
Okay.
So the third poem that you read deals very heavily with contradictions of writing and feeling and sincerity. How does this sense of contradiction inform the way you approach your writing in general?
Mm-hmm. The third poem in the first section, or
In the first section.
meeting, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think I answered in the Q&A, but I'll answer again for everyone that, the older I've gotten, the more I've kind of come to recognize that paradox is central to experience, like that we ourselves are essentially paradoxical. Yeah. I mean, Kierkegaard famously says we're not an entity, but a relation between other things. There's something relational, and the paradox comes in thinking that we're not a relation, we're a substance rather than a relation, to put it in scholastic terms. And so I think paradoxes, as I've become a little bit wiser to experience in all the years I've lived, I feel it's very much what poetry does. It tries to reconcile this paradoxical condition that the self finds itself in, and that it's a fundamental. I mean, that's a very good question, but it goes so deep. The fundamental contradiction of our being here in the world, and it's always kind of, I feel like I've arrived at understanding now why I was writing these poems all along, whereas before I was just sort of driven to write them by a kind of exasperation with experience, and but now I realize that that's what I'm doing. So the apophatic at the end of that poem, that everything is not right, not one Phoebe in the woods getting ready to sing. So you kind of invoke those things by denying them, by negating them somehow, is sort of the fundamental paradox that poem resolves around, the contradiction. Yeah.
More generally, this does bridge to another question that we had that was lodged for both of you. You're both mature poets. How have you grown as poets over the years? Do you look back on your work 30 years ago and are you happy with it, or are you more happy with the way that you've developed in that time as a poet?
It's interesting.
We're going to limit it to the work. I believe the question was also about yourself, but your work.
Refuse that part. I already spoke to this, Vijay, so you take it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I published my first book late. So I think it was a mature book. So I'm not, the difference between the poems, and I have a big batch of poems that I wrote that might be called juvenilia. And I keep thinking, well, maybe there's stuff here I can turn it into something or other, and I never really quite managed to do anything with it, although there are good images and there's sort of, because I've lost that kind of emotional connection with the person I was when I was in my 20s. And, and in my first book, the earliest poems were written in my late 20s. In fact, I want to take credit for this. I wrote when Peter and I knew each other at Columbia when we were both in the MFA program there. I wrote what I consider to be the first global warming poem.
Yeah. Okay.
It's the first poem in my first book, Wild Kingdom, which didn't come out until the 90s, but I wrote that poem. The version I wrote, the first draft, was in 1983 or maybe 1984. And, and I point that out to pat myself on the back, of course, but also we knew about global warming then. The information I got, that came out of the environmental movement of the 70s, I was kind of very much a part of that, was general knowledge. It was material in the science section of the Times, or in the kind of, and this is 1983, everybody knew the ice caps were melting, and we're only addressing it now. I mean, it's just shocking when you think about it, the extent to which there was knowledge. But yeah, I mean, those poems were gathered over a long period of time when I was doing a lot of other stuff. So there's something about your first book that's always kind of an amalgam. It never has quite the unity that the other stuff has, the other books have. But I don't consider any of that juvenilia. I always feel like, yeah, these were all mature, important. They were all kind of important statements for me anyway. And yeah.
Well, they're the poems that got us to the later poems, so they're owed gratitude in that that way. Yeah.
You're both really good at saying just something to let me link to another question. So I'm going to just do that. This we've already asked Peter, but this works perfectly with what we're talking about. Are there poems that you've written that could be juvenilia or beyond, that you've wanted to include in a collection that haven't made it in for whatever reason, whether they're not ready, they're not a right fit for that collection, or anything else?
Again, I answered this for JC.
Yeah. Well, that is also, I mean, that's the kind of question that makes me, say to myself, ouch. Because of every 10 poems I write and start to get deep into, I finish one. So there's a huge teeming file of unfinished poems on my hard drive, and they just sort of fester there, and strange things grow over them and stuff like that. So of all the, and I've only published 4 books, but I've written 10 times as many poems as I've published, and some of them have gone, some of them are like 20, 30, 40 lines that never resolve. They never become a poem and stuff like that. And, and I am longing for the day when I will no longer beat myself up over this and say that, like, this is a really deep character flaw, that there's so much that's unfinished, you know. And so yeah, for every poem that is in that book, there are 10 that didn't make it, you know.
When you find out,
Slightly different on that subject, and that is I'm quick to finish a draft of a poem so that I have, quote, a finished poem, but then will it last? Will it measure up? Will it hold? Can I find a way to polish it that I'm satisfied with? So I have stacks of, quote, finished poems, but the pity is that they'll never see light of day because I don't see them getting to that next stage.
Yeah.
And that's painful. That's painful.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, Peter, that's the difference between the way you write and the way I write.
Yep.
You know, because I write line by line.
Yep.
You know,
Yep.
I mean, my first draft is very, very close to my final draft.
Yeah.
You know, I don't write draft after draft after draft.
Yeah.
I mean, I've tried to write that way and it's never really worked for me.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that is actually a big distinction in the way that people write.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, Thomas Mann famously would write a page a day.
Right.
The page would be perfect, and then he'd go on and do the rest of the stuff. I mean, it took an incredible intellectual feat on his part, because he could imagine the whole thing unfolding, you know. But that's the way he composed the Magic Mountain.
Right.
You know? One page to, you know,
because of,
which is extraordinary. I mean, that's the way I write a poem, but it's, you know, I couldn't imagine doing it with a novel. My God.
Right. The other thing, because of teaching and because of doing translating and the many things that we both do, I have found writing residencies to be extremely helpful to me, and going to them. And my goal is always to leave with as many unfinished poems as possible. And that is to say, I will write about anything. I will go for anything that I read, something somebody says at breakfast, something that I dream. And so I just generate. And then that brings that stack of poems home, which you start to grind on. And it's like a jeweler grinding on the stones, polishing. Yeah.
It looks like we have room for one last question, which we did get a new one. And it's for both of you. What poets are you turning to for sustenance, particularly right now?
I've written about this actually just recently, and Rilke, very strangely enough, has come back into my life. I had not really read him for 40 years, and because I decided to teach a course on Rilke in English this fall at Bard. It was just an instinctive choice to do that course. So I've been rereading all of Rilke, and of course, Rilke is a poet of deep dwelling within the moment, within, again, nature, within the world, within memory, and that's been kind of nice to live alongside. It hasn't really affected my poems or my writing of poems. I think I'm kind of in a different place than Rilke as a writing poet, but it has been sustenance, I guess, would be the right word. I think that you used, Hal. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I've been reading a huge amount over the COVID period. I've been isolated in Brooklyn. My wife is taking care of her father in Manhattan, and so I've been alone here, and so it's been a sea of reading. As far as poetry goes, recently I've been reading a lot of Alan Grossman. You know, and I think for two reasons, because, you know, and Alan Grossman is very Rilkean.
Yep.
You know, it's a very important influence for him, I think.
Yep.
And you know, and I think it's that kind of, that metaphysical commitment.
Yeah.
Rather than an emotional commitment. It's sort of like, you know, the metaphysical commitment sort of reflected back into human emotional life is something that I want to affirm inside myself, because I'm thinking of that, not in terms of solace, but in terms of a kind of instrumentality, that if I'm going to go somewhere as a poet, that's where I have to go next.
Yeah.
That, and, but the other thing that's interesting about Grossman is that he's one of those poets, and I think there are great writers like this, and I think Stevens is like that. I think Rilke is like that, we don't quite have the critical technology to understand these poets yet,
Right.
the way we think about them, the categories we use, say romanticism or symbolism or modernism or any of those things. And, and they require a new articulation in order to be properly understood or accepted. I mean, I think Grossman deserves a lot more attention than he gets. And he deserved a lot more attention in his life than he got.
Right.
But it wasn't that he was a difficult poet, because there were difficult poets who got a lot of attention. The nature of his difficulty was such that people couldn't get a handle on it. So I'm wrestling with that critical problem in reading him, And he's rich in that way because he's very satisfying in terms of vision and in terms of his mysticism and in terms of his poetics. And he also poses this interesting problem for the, my intellectual side. And so he's someone I'm kind of going back and forth over, and that's been the last like 10 days or so. For some reason, I've just gotten into this Grossman jag.
I think the challenge of these times is how to live an expansive life. We don't have experience at hand. And I have found myself either writing a poem of deep memory, so because memory is there, or a poem of almost, again, surface thought, responding to the passing of language, passing of just thought, as opposed to going out in the world or going into my reading and finding something there. It's either something from way, way back or something right in front of my face that I'm just trying to, in some ways, noodle my way through, because that's all I have to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll record the songs that I sing to my beagle every day, because it's just the three of us here. You can use that. All right, we've reached the end of our night. Okay. Peter, thank you so much. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
Congratulations, Peter.
Thanks, Vijay. Thank you for reading with me. It's just it's a delight.
Yeah, and Vijay, thank you for pulling double duty tonight. We're so happy we could have you. And thank you everyone for joining us. As mentioned at the beginning of the program, I did post links to Peter and Vijay's last book in the chat. You could click on them. You could buy them from the store. Most importantly, they are worth it in both. So otherwise, I want to wish everyone a great night. Be safe, be well. This has been really wonderful.
Great. Thank you all, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks, Hal.
Bye.